Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here to read a little bit of Fishers of Books by Barton Curry. This is a book that I mentioned briefly in my Friday reads, and I unboxed it in a video on Thursday. And it's essentially a book about books, about book collecting. It was published in 1931, and Curry himself was an avid collector of books. Throughout this volume, he talks about his own experience collecting, advice he has for collectors, and even the books that he has added to his collection, the wins and the follies, so to speak. But I thought I would begin by reading to you the first chapter called The Beginning Urge. And there's quite a few great illustrations throughout the book. Maybe I'll just quickly show you the bibliomaniac's wife, which is a little cartoon here at the opening of the book. Bibliomaniac says, "Great work, dear, just the Johnson Dictionary now. The Brontes, the Austens, and the Trollops. The fire brigade should arrive presently." And so clearly this is a man, a wealthy man given the way that house looks, a man whose book collection is worth much more to him than his wife. And his wife is in clear danger up there with the flames looking at her in the library. And he's not concerned about her getting out. He's concerned about his precious book collection, which has been tossed out onto the lawn. So here we go with chapter 1, The Beginning Urge. Always are the beginnings of a book collector modest and vague, save in the case of an occasional Croesus. And I actually looked up Croesus. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But it turns out he was a Persian king who was known for issuing the first coins, I guess, within his empire, and also for just amassing huge amounts of wealth and giving extravagant gifts. And so he's sort of become a synonym for a wealthy man. So when Curry says Croesus, he is just referring to a wealthy man, I suppose. Save in the case of an occasional Croesus, or one of those restless mortals who suddenly emerge from an adventure in a bull market with a mass of winnings and not the ghost of an idea as to what to do with them. Croesus and the lucky gamblers have crowded the little collector to the wall during the past decade and raised a small group of shrewd dealers to the place of magnates of big business. Nor is this condition likely to change, notwithstanding a recurring seismic crack in all the stock exchanges round about the world. For Croesus buys with a magnificent gesture that forever prohibits him from becoming a seller. He buys with the objective of endowing a college or erecting a foundation, a sure way to immortality. It is a great boon to the small collector when he does this, provided the small collector has any considerable number of the books that are forever withdrawn from the market when Croesus shuts them away from the world in his opulent and almost invariably cold and repellent foundation. On the other hand, Croesus, as long as he collects, has been a sore trial to the little fellow. Dealers all over the world have used his name as a bogey to scare the puny collector into paying extravagant prices. "I'm not sure," whispers the dealer, "that I can let you have this book. I have the word that Croesus wants it. In fact, I have been requested to set it aside for him." "But Croesus has a copy," whines the little fellow. "True enough," responds Mr. Lazarus, "but not so good a one as this." "Will he turn on the one he has when he gets this?" asks the little fellow. "I doubt it," Lazarus responds. "You know he bought part of the collection of the Duke of Walberg, which contained 2 copies of everything of first importance. Croesus believes the Duke's grandfather had the correct idea, and he has made it known that he is in the market for a pair of all the fine things. Nevertheless, Mr. Littleweed, I am a little bit pressed for cash at the moment, and therefore not inclined to wait for the agents of Croesus to call. You may have this immaculate copy of Gay's Trivia for £200. Littleweed is convinced in the back of his mind that the price is at least £100 too high, but the subtle suggestion that Croesus covets the same book and would probably pay more than £200 for it has a curdling effect upon his brain cells. He buys the immaculate Trivia and lugs it off to his little library. He will probably have to scrimp and save to make up that £200, and more than likely he will come upon another and even more immaculate trivia in another shop at less than half the price a little later on. If so, he will be game about it and seek to console himself with the thought that the United States of America is multiplying its breed of Croesuses as a clever breeder multiplies his guinea pigs. Hence, inevitably, in the course of a few years, a superfine trivia at £200 will seem a monstrous bargain. Happily for the little weeds, and also for the piccolo millionaires who are attracted to the book collecting game, their tremulous hopes of higher and higher prices for the well-chosen books they have bought with agonizing effort is likely to be realized if they live long enough and if the fashions in collecting do not undergo a sudden unforeseen change. The ifs in collecting greatly outnumber the certainties, but the beginning collectors are not allowed to realize this. Should they burden their minds with too many ifs at the start, they would never begin. The dealer will never intrude an if or a but as to anything he has to sell. The older and more seasoned collector is usually an incorrigible optimist who keeps his own constantly increasing number of ifs to himself for his own particular and individual salvation. It is instinctive with the seasoned collector who has been over the thorny hedges of being stung, who has perhaps started out in some peculiar line of his own that suddenly went out of fashion, never to discourage a beginner. Nor is it a simple achievement to discourage a beginning hobbyist once the germ is solidly rooted. There is only one sure way to cool his rising ardor, and that is to deprive him of all his means. A temporary financial embarrassment will merely serve to interrupt the pursuit of his hobby. I write this not as a philosophical onlooker, not as a calm observer from the sidelines, but as an unqualified bibliomaniac who has ridden the hobby for a little more than a decade, during which time I have been able to analyze all the symptoms. I have much to confess, a trifling amount to boast of, and praise be, very little to regret. At first it was a bit disconcerting to have your more superior friends, and the surer-footed among your business associates, regard you as an amusing lunatic. For me to pay $5,000 for a first edition of Gray's Elegy was an act of madness that a committee of alienists should have had the job of investigating. Did I not recall that my first 3 years in journalism had brought me scarcely that sum as a total wage? And after spending that amount on one book, did I not have to support the thing by the sacrifice of at least a safe 5% per annum plus insurance? If I could sell the book in 10 years for $10,000, I would get out with a safe profit, but of course only the most outrageous luck would ever enable me to get my money back. Now for a little mild boasting. Not half 10 years had passed when I refused an offer of $10,000 for the book. I have seen an inferior copy sell for more. Whether or not it will ever bring a still higher price, I will not venture more than a guess. Writing this here in Taormina a few months after, with the native Sicilians, who were dismayed at the meager stream of tourists crossing the Atlantic, called the crack, I should be unjustifiably optimistic should I proclaim that I could sell my Gray's Elegy in the present period of economic depression for as much as $10,000. I would surely be canny enough not to make the effort in an era of worldwide pessimism following the collapse of the gambling spree of the ages. And I'll just pause here to show you the image here on page 7. It is a facsimile, I guess, of the title page of, as he says, my precious first issue, taller and wider than most, of Gray's Elegy. Price 6p, initially $17.51. Thus, early in this book, it is not my plan to dwell on the sordid side of book collecting. Far too much has been published on this phase of the adventure. The majority of articles and books on the subject have given the impression that shrewd and skillful collecting of rare books is a good deal safer and saner than buying blue chip stocks in a bull market. Had not Jerome Kern's copy of Tom Jones leaped in price from $4,000 to $39,000 in less than 4 years? Had not a copy of Shelley's Queen Mab, containing corrections and interlineations in the poet's own handwriting, brought $68,000? And what about those 5 manuscript pages of Pickwick that were sold at Sotheby's for £1,400 a page? shockingly like the sky-piercing manipulations of the Wall Street pool operators. No doubt of that, and there is no doubt that the book collecting will suffer from this overdose of sordidness to at least as great an extent as Wall Street gambling will suffer from its period of insensate inflation. But in both cases, the return to sanity will be merely temporary. The passions of the stock gambler and the passions of the book collector are at least slightly akin. Both seek to delude themselves that they are essentially investors, no matter how high they reach for the blue chips. But there the comparison ends. Nothing could be more certainly disastrous than buying books on the suggestion of ignorant tipsters. In book collecting, there is the absolute necessity of digging out facts and learning at least the rudiments of bibliography. Only in the case of a parvenu Croesus, who wished to dazzle his acquaintances with a whole library of first editions assembled as he would assemble a garden full of Italian water jars and marble fountains, is it possible to buy blindly and in wholesale quantities. Nearly every bookseller, whether he deals in new books or old, has a yarn to tell about the customer who buys an armful of books to fill his new bookcase, or 20 feet or so of shelves. It was probably the influence of this perennial story that inspired the late Peter F. Collier to advertise his subscription set of world classics as a 5-foot shelf load. The huge success of his salesmanship in this particular instance reveals somewhat the state of mind of the casual book buyer. Not even Croesus, however, would ever be likely to buy Incunabula, don't know that word, and premier first editions wholesale, but I know of an instance of building up a library of rare letters, books, and manuscripts that was essentially the same in principle as that governing the considerable number of men and women who purchased their books by the 5-foot measurement. The case I refer to was that of a fortunate speculator in shares, as they say in London. Not that this gentleman was British. On the contrary, he was one of the self-styled 100% Americans, let us call Mr. Levant, who have been the master builders of our industries and their byproducts. Having made his pile and beauty shop equipment, and having retired from this enterprise, he set out to display his shrewdness in that most fascinating of all gambling adventures, which is open to those of all ages or conditions of wealth at the lower end of Manhattan Island, USA. He devoted 14 hours a day to his leisure to demonstrate that there is no easier place in the world to make money than in Wall Street, if you have a bit of capital and pick your stocks with care. Mr. Levant did demonstrate just that during the period of the rise, with the result that his profits kept on piling up in a golden heap that began to bother him. He shoveled a ton or so off the top and built himself a Tudor mansion in the country. When this edifice was completed, he found that one wing contained a paneled room in which there were Tudor alcoves fitted with many shelves. "This is the library, Mr. Levant," said the architect. "I trust you approve." I guess so," answered Levant, "but it will take a devilish lot of books to fill those shelves." "Yes," said the architect, "but you need not worry about that little detail. The decorator can take care of the books. He will probably have special bindings made to fit them into harmonious color scheme." Okay, that line there makes me gasp and cringe. "The hell he will," snorted Levant. "You've got me wrong about books. I don't find all my reading in the newspapers and magazines, and I've listened to those old chestnuts about the get-rich-quick imbeciles who select their books by the aid of tape measure. Roughly, Mr. Architect, what is this room costing me?" "I imagine," returned the architect, "that the cost of this library in its present state will come to something in the neighborhood of $80,000. "I counted on about that figure," commented Levant. "And when this decorator person who sports the lavender shirts has sold his color schemes to Mrs. Levant, the rugs and draperies for this room will eat up another $80,000. On top of which you have the nerve to suggest that I let that fellow choose the books and bindings for my library. Now I am convinced that you're all in cahoots together to collect every last nickel of profit you can squeeze out of me. I don't mean to be insulting, but I'm entitled to my opinion. Let it be settled in your mind, and in the mind of Mr. Lavender, or Mr. Violet, or whatever his name is, that I do my own book buying." And so it was settled. the grossly offended architect of the magnificent Tudor library telephoned to his friend the decorator that their little $20,000 book deal was off. "That damned upstart," hissed the architect, "has got some scheme in his head for buying his own books. Between us, I do not believe he is straight in his mind, whether Chaucer wrote the Magna Carta or the old oaken bucket. I'll add honey to my cup if some book dealer takes the hide off him." The architect's wish was not quite fulfilled, notwithstanding that Levant paid more than $100,000 instead of $20,000 for his books. The architect and the decorator could have filled his shelves with second-hand Morocco bindings to harmonize with the draperies at a cost of $10,000. They would have been modestly satisfied with 100% profit. The dealer who finally did supply Mr. Levant with a $100,000 lot of rare books was not quite so modest as to gain the books he supplied cost him $40,000. Singularly enough, though the owner of the brand new Tudor library was the gainer in the end. It came about in this way. Levant Jr. came home from college for his summer vacation. In one of his English courses, the young man had become chummy with a classmate who loved first editions, one of those rare accidents who was, by the way, becoming a bibliomaniac of the third generation. This classmate knew his hobby. Likewise, he was a good talker, so good a talker that he inoculated Levant Jr. with at least a mild species of the germ, in consequence of which the son of the sudden Croesus returned home with a first edition of the Bigelow Papers, for which he had spent the equivalent of what his garage charged for 2 tires of his Rolls-Royce racer. Pardon me as I take a sip of water here. Arriving home after his father's little outburst with the architect, Levant Jr. proudly exhibited his purchase and announced that there was something worth considering in investing a superfluity of income in rare books. "The only trouble with that form of insanity, Dad," added young Levant, "is that it consumes a precious lot of time hunting out the right things. Also, you must absorb oodles and oodles of biographical dope, so as not to be robbed." "A pretty hopeless job, then, for a busy man like you," said Levant Sr. with a twinkle. "But tell me more about it. I'm interested. There's that new library hungry for books, and why fill a $200,000 room with trash?" Levant Jr. expanded to the extent of his wholly superficial knowledge. A few days later, Levant Sr. visited one of the best-known dealers in rare books in that part of the world. He had selected this particular dealer after his secretaries had brought him an elaborate report on what they could learn of the trade in rare books. The dealer chosen was not the big mogul of the business, but he was big enough to enjoy a turnover of almost $1 million a year. And that would have been quite a bit of money back in 1931 when this was published. And who knows exactly when this particular story is from, when this took place. 2 more facts in his favor were that he had been in business more than 30 years and numbered among his steady customers many magnates in banking, finance, and manufacturing. Levant Sr. stated his case with his casual directness to the elderly gentleman who had been buying and selling. There's that word again. Incunabula. I'm sure there's someone watching this who knows exactly what this word is and what it means. Incunabula. It's certainly something I would look up, but I'm recording on my phone, so I can't without pausing this video. So I'll just skim over that for now and do a little bit of hunting later. I gather it's something to do with books, obviously. To the elderly gentleman who had been Levant Sr. stated his case with his usual directness to the elderly gentleman who had been buying and selling Incunabulum, probably pronouncing that wrong, and the rare items of the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries for more than half his lifetime. "Mr. Kennedy," said Levant Sr., "I am about to finish a new house in which there is a large and expensive library. I wish to fill that library with books that are worth boasting about. rare books, first editions, that sort of thing. I have never collected anything but business experience and money. I am one of these new richer thanks to the stock market, than I have any right to be. Though no one ever worked harder during the 40 years I was building up a business. But because I've been lucky, Mr. Kennedy, please do not class me with the sucker rich. I am here to give you an order for $100,000 worth of rare books. My son tells me you could spend all that on a Gutenberg Bible or on one Shakespeare book, but please count that sort of thing out. There is too much space to fill. You had better come out to the house and size up the requirements. Mr. Kennedy did so, reporting to the owner as follows. You have space, sir, for about 4,000 books. You probably have some books of your own, perhaps 1,000, to which you have some slight sentimental attachment, though as books a dealer might regard them as junk. Do not discard them. They will give what some would call a human touch. Without that, a hurriedly bought new library, even though it contain 1,000 or so first editions, gives itself away. I will supply about 1,000 books that can be honestly regarded as collector's items, and about 500 more that should be in every collector's libraries. Among the 500 will be a number of sets of books such as the Bombay Kipling, with the first volume signed by the author, the Mellstock Hardy, the Valenius Stevenson, and the first collected editions of Dickens and Thackeray, a signed set of Conrad, and possibly a few others. There are sets that no collector will sneer at, and they are bound to rise slightly in value every year. These sets I can put my hands on almost immediately, but when it comes to a well-selected lot of first editions assembled by a definite plan, I shall ask you to give me at least a year. There are dealers who might unload upon you a jumbled miscellany from their stock. I could do that with very great profit to myself, but whether you believe it or not, I have a personal pride in my business and the results I obtain for my customers. I suggest that you confine your selection to 19th and 20th century novelists and poets. Were you to go back to the 17th and 18th centuries, your $100,000 would fill few shelves. Furthermore, I would probably have to ask you for 5 years' time, rather than one. That is, if it were your desire to take on such authors as Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and Sterne, and seek the finest specimens obtainable in the original state. Much of this may be strange powder to you, Mr. Levant, and as a good businessman, you realize that you are putting yourself at my mercy. My promise that I shall not rob you may amuse you. If so, please interpret it to mean that I shall select for you with all the shrewdness and cunning I possess, that I shall, nevertheless, expect to make a handsome profit. Levant was entirely satisfied with this assurance. He gave dealer Kennedy carte blanche to begin with the novelists and poets of the 19th century and carry on as far into the present as Joseph Conrad, John Galsworthy, Bernard Shaw, Arnold Bennett, and Booth Tarkington. Yeah, even unto a first issue of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. It was my privilege to watch this collection for Mr. Levant grow in dealer Kennedy's shop, and while 99 collectors out of 100 might regard it as an almost criminal method of filling one's shelves, the assemblage itself could be condemned only by the supercritical. Compared with the cost of many of the first editions of the early Victorians, the prices paid for some of the moderns were way out of proportion, and buying moderns must always be a gamble for most of the lifetime of the collector, notwithstanding the very short time, less than 4 years, that has passed since the Levant job lot was gathered for him. Many of his early Victorians have trebled and quadrupled in value, far more than making up for any likely slump in his moderns. Regarding this episode in book collecting wholly from the material side, Mr. Levant would have no difficulty today, save in an interlude of deep depression, in selling his $100,000 purchase at a considerable advance, even after deducting the 20% fee for the auctioneer and incidental cataloging and advertising expenses. Mr. Kennedy has, you may be sure, kept him informed of this fact from time to time, undoubtedly with the hope of inspiring the gentleman with at least a speculator's interest in book collecting. The real urge to collect has been known to have such beginnings, if rarely. Alas for dealer Kennedy's hopes, the attempted inoculation failed. Levant was sated with rare books when he got his $100,000 worth, and quit abruptly upon the delivery of the last package containing Butler's The Way of All Flesh, Irwin and Irwin Revisited. You'll never pull me in as a gambler in rare books, Mr. Kennedy, said Levant. It's too tame and too long drawn out. Also, there is no organized market for buying and selling that will let a fellow know where he stands from day to day. Moreover, I've no background when it comes to sensing what is and what isn't good to buy. It's altogether too damned intricate for this member of the Levant family. I should be delighted if Levant Jr. would take it up and make a hobby of it, but I'm afraid he has the money bug and the sport bug too badly to go any distance with an intellectual line. I can see that if anyone with an oversized bank account would start early enough in this book collecting game, live long enough, and keep plugging at it without ever being sidetracked or discouraged, he'd have a magnificent asset for his old age. But book collecting, game, live long enough, and keep plugging at it. I can see that if anyone with an oversized bank account would start early enough in this book collecting game, live long enough, and keep plugging at it without ever being sidetracked or discouraged, he'd have a magnificent asset for his old age. But book collecting, I reckon, can't be forced. It's going to happen. With the Levants, it hasn't happened. Here's a check to close our account. As you enter it in your ledger, you can write under it a satisfied customer, and I'll be glad to add my signature. So that is the first chapter in Fishers of Books. Chapter 2 is called How Collectors Happen.